It all started with a missing person report on a quiet, fog-draped morning in December. The town of Valley Creek, nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado, had always been peaceful. Too peaceful, some would say. But that peace was shattered when little Tommy Walker disappeared from his bed, leaving no trace but the cold, unsettled air of his empty room. What's strange is, he wasn't the first. Over the past 2 decades, there had been whispers of disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and a strange silence that seemed to seep into the fabric of Valley Creek. Some locals blamed it on the old mine that had closed down in the early 90s. Others thought it was something much darker, something that lingered in the silence, waiting to be acknowledged. But when Tommy went missing, the whispers grew louder. People spoke in hushed tones about the quiet nights when the town fell into an unnatural stillness, and the air felt thick with an unseen presence. There were no sounds of crickets, no wind rustling through the trees, and, most disturbingly, no voices. The local news ran the story. 8-year-old boy vanishes in Valley Creek. No leads yet, authorities baffled. It was a story that caught the attention of people far beyond the town's borders. But the truth, the real truth, would never make the news. Sheriff Charles Deacon was a man who had seen his share of strange things. After years of working in small towns, he'd learned that places like Valley Creek had secrets buried deep. But this was something else. He stood in Tommy Walker's room, staring at the unmade bed, his mind racing. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no footprints in the fresh snow outside. It was as though the boy had vanished into thin air. But there was something in the room, something Sheriff Deacon couldn't quite explain. It wasn't visible. No, it was something he felt. A thick, suffocating silence, the kind that made your ears ring. It was like being submerged underwater, the world above muffled, distant, and cold. Over the next few days, as Deacon interviewed neighbors and searched the woods, the silence followed him. People spoke less, the town seemed quieter than usual, and the sheriff could swear that, at night, there was a hum, an almost imperceptible sound that grew louder the closer he got to the mine. The Valley Creek mine had been shut down after a string of deadly accidents in 1991. According to the official reports, faulty equipment and bad management had caused the collapse that killed 23 miners. But the locals had a different story. They said something had been found in the mine, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. But it was what happened next that pushed the sheriff over the edge. A call came in from the old Johnson house on the outskirts of town. Jane Johnson, the widow who lived alone, had phoned the station, whispering in a frantic tone that she could hear something outside her window. "It's them," she said. "They're in the woods. They're waiting." By the time Deacon arrived, the house was silent. Jane was gone, and the only trace left of her was a half-filled cup of coffee still steaming on the kitchen table. And outside the window, in the snow, were 2 sets of footprints. One belonged to Jane. The other was much larger. Weeks passed, and Valley Creek fell deeper into a state of uneasy silence. More people disappeared. It was never more than one person at a time, but they all vanished in the same way. No sign of a struggle, no evidence, just an empty home and an overwhelming quiet in their wake. But it was the strange phenomenon of the silent nights that terrified the town most. Once or twice a week, the town would fall into complete, suffocating silence. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Dogs refused to leave their houses, and birds disappeared from the skies. On those nights, not a single noise could be heard, not even the faint hum of electricity. That's when the rumors started. It was during this time that a movie called A Quiet Place was making headlines across the country. The film, about a family forced to live in silence to avoid deadly creatures that hunted by sound, had taken the world by storm. Some of the townspeople joked that their situation was starting to feel a lot like the movie. But soon, the jokes stopped, because the disappearances weren't stopping. Then, one evening, a group of teenagers, local kids who grew up in Valley Creek, decided to test the theory. They drove out to the old mine, armed with flashlights and a sense of teenage invincibility. One of them had heard that the mine might be connected to the strange happenings in the town, that whatever had been disturbed years ago was still down there, lurking in the dark. It was just supposed to be a fun night, something to scare each other with. But they didn't realize how real the danger was. The mine had been sealed off for years, but the teens found an opening large enough to squeeze through. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the further they ventured, the quieter it became. It was as though the walls absorbed sound, leaving nothing but the faint echo of their footsteps. The deeper they went, the more they felt it, the silence. It pressed down on them, suffocating and absolute. At first, they thought it was just nerves, the product of being underground in a place that had seen so much death. But then they heard it, a low, guttural sound. A growl? No, it was more like a hum, vibrating through the walls. The group stopped, exchanging nervous glances. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. But before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them rumbled. The walls seemed to shift, and a cold breeze swept through the mine, carrying with it a sound, a whisper. They turned to leave, but it was too late. The exit had collapsed, trapping them inside. For hours, they banged on the walls, calling for help, but the sound never echoed back. And in the silence, they began to hear things. Whispers that didn't belong to them. Footsteps that grew closer but never revealed their source. Only 2 of the teens made it out alive. When they were finally rescued, they refused to talk about what had happened. Their eyes were hollow, their voices barely above a whisper. But one of them, a boy named Mark, said something that chilled the sheriff to his core. "They're in the silence," he whispered. "They're waiting." Sheriff Deacon couldn't let it go. He began digging into the history of Valley Creek, desperate to find a connection between the strange occurrences and the old mine. What he found was more disturbing than he could have imagined. Old newspaper clippings from the 1920s told a story of a small group of settlers who had first established Valley Creek. They built their homes near the creek, believing it to be a place of peace and prosperity. But within a few years, settlers began to disappear. The reports were eerily similar to what was happening now. People vanishing without a trace, homes left undisturbed, and always the same whispering in the air. The final clipping, dated 1926, reported the discovery of a strange artifact deep in the mine. A carved stone tablet with inscriptions that no one could decipher. The miners who found it were said to have gone mad, raving about voices in the dark before taking their own lives. The mine was sealed shortly after. Sheriff Deacon knew he had to stop whatever was happening, but he didn't know how. The disappearances were becoming more frequent, and the silence in the town was growing heavier. It felt like the calm before a storm, one they couldn't escape. And then, one night, the town went completely silent. It wasn't like the other quiet nights. This was different. There was no wind, no sound of any kind. The air was thick, oppressive. Deacon could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. He drove to the mine, a sinking feeling in his chest. As he stepped out of the car, he heard it. A low hum, almost like a whisper, growing louder as he approached the entrance. Inside the mine, the silence was even worse. It was as if the very air had been sucked out, leaving nothing but a vacuum of dread. And then he saw them. Figures, moving in the darkness, their forms barely visible, like shadows slipping through the walls. And in the center of the cavern, the old stone tablet stood, glowing faintly in the dark. The sheriff approached it, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever. They weren't words, just sounds, echoing through the silence. But they carried meaning, and that meaning was terror. As he reached out to touch the tablet, the whispers stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was total silence. But it wasn't comforting. It was the silence of death, the kind that comes before something terrible. And then, from behind him, came a voice, low and guttural.
It's showtime.
Sheriff Deacon was never seen again. In the months that followed, Valley Creek became a ghost town. The disappearances continued until there was no one left to disappear. The mine was sealed, but the whispers still lingered, waiting for the next person to listen. They say if you visit Valley Creek on a quiet night, you can hear them, the voices in the silence. And if you're not careful, they might hear you too. So the next time you find yourself in a quiet place, remember, sometimes silence isn't peaceful. It's a warning. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Scary Stories to You for more spine-tingling tales. Don't forget to share with friends who love a good scare, and let us know in the comments, what would you do if you found yourself in the silence of Valley Creek? Stay tuned for more terrifying stories, if you dare.